Good afternoon, everybody. It's about noon. We may just wait a couple more minutes as people are still signing in. So just hang in there and we'll start our presentation here shortly.
I guess with the bifocal, she has to tip her head back maybe there.
I believe we'll get started if Rachel is ready and I'm ready. So let's begin. Welcome to the May 2026 program of the League of Women Voters Lunch and Learn series. I am Paula Urick, Chair of the Lunch and Learn Committee, with a few logistic details before we get started with today's presentation, a 2026 legislative update. First, please mute your audio and turn off your video so we can focus on our speaker. We use the chat function for questions, so please type your remarks there. We will monitor the chat and relay questions to our speaker. In case you didn't know, for over 100 years, the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, has encouraged informed and active participation in government, worked to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Membership is open to all. For further information, you can go to lincolnleague.org. League of Women Voters, Lincoln-Lancaster is proudly nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government. Videos of previous Lunch and Learns are available on the League's website, also lincolnleague.org. Now let's get to today's program. Our speaker today is Rachel Gibson. Many of you know Rachel as the Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters-Nebraska and her reporting on the unicameral. Rachel previously served on the Fair Maps Redistricting Committee, Education Policy Action Team, and the Social Policy Action Team. Before starting at the League, she spent 10 years as an advisor, educator, and program coordinator in higher education. She earned a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Kansas. So please help me and by sharing your attention and welcome, Rachel.
Well, hello. Thank you so much. I always feel funny when people read my introduction because I think of, oh, I just know lots of legislative stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screens before we jump in here. Let's see, make sure folks can see. Is that showing up for folks all right?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. All right. Well, as mentioned, my name is Rachel Gibson. I'm the Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. I know many of you. I'm very excited to be here to talk a little bit about our last Nebraska legislative session. And for those of you who have been joining us on the Sunday nights, this presentation has some information, but there's more here. So don't feel like you'll be hearing the exact same thing the last time we met. So with that, Paula did a great job of highlighting what the League of Women Voters is, but I will just reiterate that we are a nonpartisan group. And as mentioned, that doesn't mean we don't talk about policy or context or, it's not like we don't say the words of parties. It just means that our goal is really on the voter. I'm lucky because I get to work in kind of our second space with many of you in this legislative advocacy role. And so we have about 40 volunteers that serve on 6 different action teams. So I couldn't do what I do without these wonderful folks. They really dig in and kind of highlight bills we should be paying attention to. And then I just stream the legislature all the time. So that's where this is coming from. All right, so let's talk quickly about where we're headed today. I'm going to do a quick by the numbers because I think that's a really great way to capture some of the big pieces. Then we'll talk about legislative highlights. And I want to just give the context that we pass a lot. And so these are just the ones that either the league was very focused on or we spent a lot of time, the legislature spent a lot of time and focus on. I will also say that I excel in breadth, not depth. So if you have specific questions about bills, feel free to ask. And if I do not know, I will be honest with you and then do some digging to get the answer. Then we're going to briefly talk about kind of the recap of where we're at budget-wise. This is the gift that keeps giving. So to have some context, because I think we will be continuing to talk about budget for the next few years. And then I'll just share some general themes and my observations, and then what that is going to do with what comes next. So that is where we are headed today. Let's start with by the numbers. So the 109th legislature short session. So, we work in 2-year chunks. This is the second year that this group of legislators has been together. And we have some big numbers to look at. There are 592 pieces of legislation introduced in 2026. That is on top of the carryover bills from the first session, because 2-year chunks. So we had 800-ish pieces of legislation that were viable to focus on. Of those 592, 322 bills never left committee. And I'd like to, in the interim, I'm going to dig in and see how this compares to previous years. But to me, this felt like a lot of bills were stuck in committee. And there was conversation about what got talked about and what got voted out of committee. So it felt like this year was a little more gatekeeping, which, from a league's perspective was both good and bad. We kept some bills where they not on the floor, and we also didn't get to hear some bills because they got stuck in committee. 137 of those actually became law. And it's a little messy with how they do that because there were lots of amendments that got added into different bills, but broadly you get a sense of kind of the funnel. I think this is an important highlight of those, not just the 592, but as I mentioned, the full biennium. The governor brought 60 bills. There were 60 bills brought by senators on behalf of the governor. And I think that's noteworthy because senators are only allowed to bring 20 of their own bills. So the governor brought 3 times as many as a single senator might be able to. And I think that really highlights one of the themes we did see this session was the governor's involvement, the executive branch's involvement. Then we get to the money, 471 million. That was the shortfall in our state budget when we started the session. It's a very big number. Some folks didn't see that coming. Many folks did see that coming, but it definitely created some problems going through the session. By the end of session, they had managed to get the budget down to a $6 million surplus. The asterisks there we'll talk more about because within 2 weeks we were back in the red. So I feel like that $6 million was short-lived. Along with the budget, it took 3 attempts to actually pass the budget, which is very unusual. Not unheard of, but extremely unusual. And they actually had to suspend their own rules because they missed their internal deadline for getting the budget passed. So it took 3 tries to get to a place where the 49 of them, or enough of them, could agree to move forward. And then finally, 718 principals represented by lobbyists. So what this means is there are, you might have an entity that has multiple lobbyists, individuals, the lobbyist is the individual, or you might have one lobbyist that represents a lot of things. Basically, this is the roughly 700 different organizations or businesses that are registered with our legislature. And I highlight this one again because it gets to one of the themes. This is not an unusually high number, but the public doesn't often think about the role that those folks play. So I wanted to give some context of how many we're talking about. Okay, so that's by the numbers. Let's dig into some of the legislative pieces. So when we started session, if you were at any of the presentations I did at the beginning of the year, we looked at what was introduced in terms of bills, and these are the things we thought we would be talking about. Taxes, obviously, both from a budget standpoint and from a just a real interest with this group and with our governor about changing our tax system. We thought we'd talk about immigration. There were several bills brought about protecting undocumented folks, protecting spaces like churches or schools, requiring ICE to wear identification, lots of different pieces there. Housing, kind of on two fronts. We saw a lot of bills about funding for housing. And then we also saw a handful of bills about restrictions of housing and landlords and tenants' rights and those types of things. We also continued to see anti-trans measures. So this is Senator Kauth. If you're familiar, this has been one of her key issues since she's been in the legislature. She has already shepherded a couple different bills that have restricted gender-affirming care, access to sports teams. She continued to bring additional bills, so there were 3 in particular. And so we anticipated, because she had said that is really something she wanted to highlight, that might be something we spent some time on. Access to benefit programs. I mean, this is both in state and national. We're hearing a lot about SNAP, food security, Medicaid, different types of, sometimes called entitlement programs. So those types of programs. Also several bills about behavioral and disability support. We have some real champions in our legislature on those issues. And then there was the slew of kind of like environmental authority bills. So, what entity in our executive branch is in charge of water or energy, or who sets the policy about broadband and how does that relate to, the internet or with data centers? So we saw a handful of those. And then this one was, there were not many, but something very much close to near and dear to our hearts as folks who want, the most democracy. Citizen-led ballot initiatives. There have been some efforts to not only roll back what was passed, but this year we actually saw a few bills introduced that would change the process to make it harder for us as citizens to lead those ballot initiatives. So that's what we thought in the beginning. Now, what actually happened, by the end, what we ended up seeing, because of time, priorities of different senators and the speaker, and group dynamics played a huge role with this legislature. Some of the things we anticipated were covered. So we did see a lot on taxes. We did see a good amount on housing. We saw some about access to benefit programs, not necessarily in the way we were anticipating, a little more tinkering around the edges. And then there were some more unexpected. Education ended up taking up a fair amount of time in really three main ways. One was a conversation about the ability to suspend kids below 3rd grade or 2nd grade. The second was about 3rd grade reading and the potential of implementing a statewide requirement to hold back 3rd graders who don't meet certain reading metrics. And then the third was around private school scholarships. So education ended up taking a little more time than I think we anticipated this time around. Criminal justice also had quite a bit. We saw some related to domestic violence. We definitely saw some focus on implementing higher level penalties and things like that. The one that caught me off guard the most, I think, was the amount of corporate and business benefit policies and programs that were implemented and entertained. This, as time went forward, you could very much tell that this is a business-friendly legislature. Agribusiness in particular was a real area of interest. This took some really interesting things, like we had a livestock and branding bill, but then we also had one about farmers' data. So it's just huge range of that agribusiness piece. So broadly, that's what we looked at. I want to talk about a couple specific highlights of what did pass and then what didn't pass. Again, not exhaustive lists. This is based on what they focused on and what's kind of on the priority for the league. So of course, the budget passed after 3 attempts, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. The corporate incentives that I mentioned passed. There was one very large bill that was the focus of a lot of the conversation, which was written in a way that really was meant for one business in particular to have them stay headquartered here or stay here in Nebraska. But those were some corporate incentives. There were also smaller sort of business-oriented things that clarified, if there's a disagreement, we're going to land on the side of the employer as opposed to the employee. So there were several smaller ones, but there were definitely some big corporate incentives there. I mentioned the increase in criminal penalties. For example, there was one bill that domestic violence repeat offenders. The way the law was previously is that if you had one offense, you were at a certain level, and that matched for if it was a non-domestic violence, it was just violence. The second offense, though, for non-domestic violence had a higher penalty than the domestic violence did. So that was bringing those to parity. That's just one example. There were several others, some around drugs and substances and things like that. There was a Youth Reentry and Transition Support Act. This was Senator McKinney's bill, so some focus on our system-impacted youths. The Hunger-Free Schools Act passed. I want to take a quick second on this one. This was a bill that has been brought several years by Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, and this year Senator Hunt prioritized it. On first round of debate, there was pushback, and the pushback was, we don't have the money for this. And what this would do would be provide lunch and breakfast for low-income students, essentially, beyond what already exists, because the bar is fairly low. So they said, if you find the money somewhere, because we have no money, we'll consider this. And so Senator Cavanaugh went out and actually found private donors to fund a pilot program. So when she came back for the next round of debate, the opposition changed into a couple different things. And one of them was, this is for public schools. Why aren't we doing it for private schools? Because the donor said specifically they just want to spend the money for public schools. With that, Senator Cavanaugh worked with Senator Bozen, and they found money in the budget to provide these lunches for students in private schools that meet the same requirements. And with that amendment, it passed. I give all that context because, number one, good, we're feeding kids who need to be fed. That's really important. And also, it's insightful to see that the only way that they would agree to fund public school kids getting food was if that money came privately, and private schools if that money came publicly, if that makes sense. So I highlight that as a really complicated, messy piece of how legislation got made this session. Other things that passed, the Livestock Brand Act. This is for anyone who's in the ag business. This is something that has been talked about for decades, basically about feedlots and fees and who pays feeds, and kind of a push and pull between larger businesses and smaller calf cow producers. And so they finally came to a conclusion. It sounds like it leans a little bit more to the business entity, but the rural senators, especially those who work in this area, agreed to a compromise. So that finally got passed. This one flew under the radar a little bit, but I really want to highlight this, especially because I know there are folks in this group who care deeply about this issue. In Nebraska, we have public power. So it's not a business. We own it as the citizens of Nebraska. There was a bill introduced that said that the state can't use eminent domain to take over a power plant, which that sounds sort of reasonable. But really what this is doing is this is opening the door to private entities coming in to build power plants and then enter the market as competitors for public power, driving up the costs of public power for regular Nebraskans. And especially with the influx of interest in data centers coming to our state, this has set the groundwork for privatization of our public power. And then finally, I like to end on some again, from the league standpoint, some wins. When the Prenatal Plus program, so this is kind of a really focused program for women at risk of losing their lives or their babies' lives, low birth weight, things like that. This program gives them some extra support throughout pregnancy and shortly after. It was passed a few years ago. It was passed with a sunset, meaning they would only do it so long, and then if it was working, they would keep it going. The sunset was supposed to come, and so they got rid of the sunset. So that program is going to continue. The other is childcare subsidies, which really fascinating program. I did not know as much about this. I won't get into it today, but I would say do some reading because it is quite interesting. Basically, during the pandemic, we raised the income level that people could access this program, which is support to help pay for childcare. Doesn't necessarily totally cover it. People are still paying into that program as well based on their income. But what this did is it kind of raised that level a bit to a more reasonable level. It was sunset to kick back down to what it used to be. And that would have put hundreds, thousands of families in a pickle as far as finding childcare. And so that sunset was removed. That was a real hard fought effort, but very good to not only provide care for kiddos, but keep folks in the workforce that way. So those are some highlights of what did pass. I want to touch on a few things about what didn't pass. The first one from a league standpoint is winner take all. This has just been a conversation for the past 2 years. It's actually been longer than that, but it's been a big conversation the past 2 years. You all are probably familiar that Nebraska splits our electoral votes. We are one of 2 states that do. So basically, we have 5 votes for the president. 2 go to whoever wins the state overall. That leaves us 3. So each congressional district gets to decide where their vote goes. This is really about the Nebraska 2nd, which is the Omaha area, which on paper is really 50-50. And over the past few years has swapped back and forth of which presidential candidate they have given their electoral college vote to. President Trump has asked that we eliminate this program. He's spoken with our governor. Our governor has really made this a priority. There was not interest with our senators, which I think is good because the system we have is actually more representative than a winner-take-all model. So that did not end up moving forward, which was great. I do not think that is gone, but for now, we're not living under that. The anti-trans bills that we anticipated did not move. What's really interesting about those is they all got heard in 3 different committees. I want to say only one of them got voted out of committee, but none of them got scheduled. So towards the end of the session, Senator Kauth attempted to add different ones to bills that, depending on your view, did or did not relate to the bill. Ultimately, none of them moved forward, but it was quite a process, and it actually ended up, stopping some good legislation because those things were attached. But they did not move forward. Criminalizing, I meant to say unhoused, not housing, but there was a bill that Senator Anderson brought that would have basically made it criminal to be on unhoused and living on the streets. Lots of data and background and experience there saying this isn't the way to approach homelessness or unhoused folks, and so that one did not move forward. Another one that the league was really paying attention to was in our Constitution, this Nebraska State Constitution. When we talk about voting, it says every Nebraskan has the right to vote, essentially, and they wanted to change it to only Nebraskans have the right to vote, meaning that citizenship piece. It really didn't change anything because we have other restrictions that people who are not citizens already cannot vote in Nebraska. So it was really more performative. And additionally, as we started digging in, we realized that if that performative change was made, it also potentially could set us up to have other folks have their voices restricted, because saying everyone can vote is very different than saying only can vote. You can put more restrictions on that. So that did not move forward, which was really good. I mentioned the third grade retention bill. That got a lot of back and forth and ultimately died, and I think it was a bit of a surprise to everyone. I think it died on select files, so it was well through the process. But that did not move forward. One of the first bills that didn't advance was an abortion coercion screening bill. So this was a carryover from last year that basically would have written in statute the requirement for anyone providing abortion to screen for coercion by a partner or someone else. This is already something that our providers do. It would have also been the first time we put something like that in statute, and it also did not address coercion for not considering abortion. So that ended up failing by one vote from moving forward, which is good broadly because, again, that would have put, this is the league's perspective and our stance on abortion and reproductive access. It would have put OBGYNs in statute in a way that has not been done before, and really started legislating medical care in a way that could open the door to lots of other concerning things. Also that didn't pass, which we wish it had, was the protection of the Environmental Trust Fund. When we talk about budget in a minute, you'll see that the budget process pulled funds from things that had been dedicated for other sources. So this was an attempt to ratchet that down even further. So those were protected funds, and that failed right at the end, didn't have the votes to make it past cloture. And then landlord discrimination. This was squarely directed, well, currently squarely directed at Lincoln. One of our senators brought a bill that would basically say landlords don't have to consider all sources of income, and you can't make a rule as a municipality that would restrict that. So basically, Section 8, child support, alimony, anything that's not, what you think of as traditional income, as long as it's lawful, they wanted to say you can choose which sources of income you decide to count when you're determining if a tenant can afford to live in your space. Okay, I see a quick question in the chat, which, yay, questions in the chat, I appreciate it. Can you give further examples of how every to only could be more restrictive? Yes. So right now, let's say that I go in to vote, and the person says, you can't vote, and the Constitution says you can't, and I say, it says every Nebraskan, and I'm a Nebraskan, therefore I can vote. If we changed it to only, I could go in and vote, and I could say, I'm a Nebraskan, I'm here to vote. And they could say, yeah, but they passed a law that only Nebraskans in blue can vote. Well, I'm wearing blue right now, but only Nebraskans in yellow can vote. That's not in contradiction, right? But if it was you couldn't restrict it and say only people in yellow could vote. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, is that every keeps it the protective of everyone, whereas only is putting a lid, and you can make it more restrictive from there. Hopefully that made sense. Okay. Imagine people could, okay, good, it made sense. Perfect. All right. And again, please throw chats or comments in the chat. Questions, I'm happy to answer them. All right, so let's shift gears and talk budget, which is where most of our time was spent. We're going to start with the journey of this year's budget for the visual learners. This is what our graph looked like throughout the year. At different points, we started the session in a $471 million shortfall. Again, some folks said we saw this coming, others said we didn't. Our governor's approach was, this isn't an issue. What this basically came from was kind of two pieces. One, they passed legislation to reduce income tax for corporate and individuals for the highest earning brackets a few years ago. And those have been stair steps. So, we didn't go from 7 to 3 right away. We went 7 to 6 to 5. And so each year, we have one more year of them. That has decreased the money that has come in from those taxes. So we have less money than we previously did coming in because of income tax cuts. The other piece here is that around the same time, we created separate funds, particularly related to property tax relief. So if you think all of our tax dollars go into a big bucket, and then that bucket gets used for services and things, basically what happened is we made a couple tiny other buckets that then we took out of that general fund, put into the tiny bucket that was just for property tax relief, which takes money out of the ability that we can spend on services. So we have continued to put money every year into those funds for property tax relief, even though the state is not the one who sets or takes in or uses property taxes. So basically, we have a bucket, we are putting less in the bucket, and then we poked a couple holes in the bucket. And so that is why we are continuing to see this deficit. So we started with 471 million in shortfall, and then it impressively got worse as the session went on. So that grew to 646 by mid-session. There were forecasting changes about how good we think the economy is going to be, so that changes things. We also saw less brought in tax dollars and actual receipts, so we had to address that as well. So when they finally did pass the budget in April, they had to cut stuff. That was a big piece of where we got that money, and we'll talk about it in a second in detail. But through that, they had moved it up to only $38 million in a shortfall, and that was in early April. They then passed a couple more bills that raised funds, and we'll talk about what those are, so that we got to the point that we had 6 million in the green by the time they passed everything. And then within 2 weeks, we were back in the red by 72 million, again, based on kind of those, the receipts that actually came in, and also the projections of what's coming in the future. So it was quite a journey. So how did they balance that budget for the 2 weeks that it was balanced? First thing, spending cuts on programs. And I just want to emphasize that this is after several years of spending cuts. So this, there was one senator who said, we are beyond the bone at this point. We have cut all of the fat and the muscle. So this cuts to programs. The second way they did that, and we saw this is also not the first year they've done this, is that they transferred money out of dedicated funds to the general fund. So for example, the environmental trust. That one's not a great example. Let me pick a different one. Motor vehicles. There might be funds that's specifically for DMVs working. Basically, they looked at it and said, you look like you've got some money there. We're going to take that so that you can't use that money for your purpose and put it in the general fund to use for whatever we need. Another way that they did this, and again, this is also not the first year that they've done this, but they took money out of our cash reserve, which is our rainy day fund. So basically, we have a bucket of money that if everything exploded tomorrow, we would have this in reserve that we could keep functioning as a government for a couple months. We have depleted that a lot. And actually, when we got to that second deficit, the governor was encouraging taking more out, and our appropriations chair finally said, we can't, that's not fiscally responsible. Other ways that we balance, so that's all the ways that we could, scrounge up money, raising specific fees. So like a marriage license, it was $25. I think it's up to $60 now, but going across the board and trying to find little places where fees could be raised, which is controversial because there's a conversation about a tax and a fee. And there was a conversation about should we have more fees on more things in the court system. And the argument was everyone should be able to access the court system. That's what their taxes pay for. And the other argument was, yeah, but not everyone always uses the court system, so shouldn't the people using it have to pay? So it was this really interesting conversation, but they did end up raising those fees. They also raised specific sales taxes and excise taxes. I also just want to highlight some things they did not consider. No conversation about pausing, stopping, or reversing income tax cuts. Again, we're not even to the full bottom of that cut. People brought it up on the floor, but it was not a real consideration. Also reducing the amounts going to special property tax relief funds, those little buckets. No interest in tapping into those or reducing the amount. Taking money from special projects like the Perkins County Canal or the prison. And I will say, I think they eventually took a little bit out of the Perkins County Canal funds. So there's some of these big ticket items that the governor's prioritized that money is untouchable. And those are some of the ones that were pointed out there. And then decreasing certain tax business incentives and programs. That would have been another way to bring in more revenue. Not only did we not decrease them, we actually increased some. So those were kind of the way that they chose to fix the budget, and they would not consider to fix the budget. Okay. Before we jump into this, I'm seeing a quick question. What determines if you are a Nebraskan for voting? Great question. And I should look at the Constitution because I can't remember if it says citizen or Nebraskan. I will look and clarify. I think it says citizen, and then that would be clear of what counts as a Nebraskan. One second. Okay, so we continue. Again, budget, how did we get to our $6 million surplus for 2 weeks? Big thing was cuts from the general fund. I'm just throwing these up real quick. These, and I will share this so you can dig in. These are the places that they said this area doesn't need as much money. So they reduced how much they were giving, or in some case cut a lot, if not all of it. Now, they did find some places where they felt like needed more money from the general fund. And these are the ones that they assessed were worth adding money while we were taking away money from these others. So it gives you a sense of priorities. So that was from the general fund, the big bucket. Now, the second thing we talked about was taking money from those specific funds. These are some of the funds that they took specific money for. You can see this is very broad. This is not just a few, it's a lot. And in some cases, you know, our governor would talk about pillowcase money, that's his phrase for it, which is, you know, you look at all the accounts and say, hey, there's a bunch of money in this account. We're going to take that. Well, that organization, and I believe this was the DMV, had been saving that money so they were able to do a project. So it looked on paper like they had the money, but they had purposely been saving it to improve the technology system at the DMV. So in some cases, in fact, in one case, it was grant money that had already been committed and they pulled it back. And we weren't done, there were more. So here are some additional ones that were money was taken out of. I will also say there was over 20 other funds that they looked at and they took at either the interest that came out of that from the investments or the remaining balance. So it wasn't even a transfer of some money. It was, we're just going to take all the money and kind of make that fund go away. So budget, big picture. We came in with a huge deficit, made the deficit smaller by mostly cutting programs, raising some fees, and borrowing money from places we'd already dedicated it to and our own savings account to balance the budget, to which 2 weeks later was no longer balanced. And if you look at the projections, even from the balanced budget, we would be in several $1 million of deficit starting next year. So we will be talking about budget again. All right. So last little piece here, some themes and not last piece, but second to last, themes and observation about the legislature. High level takeaways. I mentioned those principal lobbyists. The power of the lobby was very evident this session, and particularly around the livestock branding conversation. There was a lot of pressure put on by lobbyists and organizations and things of that nature. Same thing with the third grade retention bill. That probably died because of the power of lobbyists. And when I say lobbyists just means someone who is advocating for someone other than themselves. There are paid lobbyists. There are also advocacy lobbyists. So lobbyist gets kind of like it's a dirty word, not necessarily, but that it's basically someone outside of the legislature. There was really a modest amount, surprisingly, of legislation, and in type. There were not a lot of swinging for the fences type of bills. And we continued to see this omnibus, or what they call Christmas tree bill. So I mentioned at the beginning, we passed 137 bills, but a lot of those weren't a single thing. They then added other bills as amendments as they went through, which makes legislating hard because you're voting on a lot of things instead of just one thing, which is exactly that legislation by amendment. We mentioned the slow process, particularly those bills stuck in committee. And then I wanted to highlight that I am working on senator summaries. So each senator, you can see what they introduced and their votes on some key bills. So that's coming soon. I finally want to highlight the tension that was there with the executive branch. I'm going to talk briefly about vetoes because I think this kind of encapsulates it best, but this was a constant. There was lots said about the tension with the executive branch. So the governor this year vetoed 5 bills. They were from Senator Roundtree, which basically would have expanded options for folks with disabilities for housing. Senator Greca, which would have made it possible for state employees, specifically state troopers, to have paternal leave. Senator Frederickson, which would have limited the amount that managed care organizations can require of a copay. So basically it was trying to protect from organizations increasing how much Medicaid, Medicare folks have to pay into their care. John Kavanaugh, which was a really simple one that just basically added flood mitigation and ice and snow removal to what falls under emergency response activities, which would allow cities and counties and municipalities to mobilize faster for those issues. And then finally, Senator Conrad brought a bill about reporting requirements for colleges and universities. All of these passed. Many passed with overwhelming majorities. One of them passed with all 49 senators. The governor vetoed these. 4 of them they brought for a veto override. 15 senators changed their votes on Senator Roundtree's. None of these were successfully a veto override. They all failed. So 15 senators changed their votes for Senator Roundtree's. 20 senators changed their votes on Senator Greca's. 9 on Senator Frederickson's, and 26 senators changed their vote. 49 senators voted to pass this bill. 26 did not support it anymore after the governor vetoed it. And then Conrad did not bring, that was the closest one, and so she did not bring that for a veto override. I just used this as an example of the only thing that changed between these things passing, many with huge majorities, was the governor's veto. And that is significant numbers of our senators who, based on that and requests from the executive branch, did not override. So this gives you a sense of the power of our executive branch and our legislative branch currently. Okay, I'm seeing some questions. I want to hit real quick what comes next, and then I'll hop to those. First thing is elections. That's what's happening next. So like I said, we're biennium. We finished our 2nd year with this group. Next year in the spring, we're getting a new group of senators, new dynamics. It'll be great fun. These are our current 49 senators. Of these, 24 of them don't have elections this year because we do half odd, half even districts. Of the remaining, 9 are not running because they are term limited. 2 others have decided not to run for other reasons, which leaves the remaining senators 4 of which are running unopposed, so they've already won their seats, and 9 are running in re-elections. I also want to highlight one of the unopposed, that purple one there. That is a seat that was term limited, but only one person ran in that district. So they are just now the representative. 9 are running for re-election. That's these with the yellow boxes. And then we have one special election for the senator who resigned at the beginning of the year due to sexual harassment. So it's a lot of new faces. Why does all this matter? Voting is especially powerful in Nebraska, and I use this visual. New Mexico and Idaho have similar populations to Nebraska. They both have around 100 legislators making law. We have 49. So as you can see, the little dot is bigger. The weight of a single senator's vote is more powerful in Nebraska. So then to go the next step is our elections in Nebraska are close. In 2024, 10 of 25 races were won by under 1,000 votes. 3 of them were under 200, and the closest in 2024 was 135. The closest in the past 20 years was 20 votes. 20 votes determined one seat of 49. And as we've seen, those votes are real close on a lot of things. So I just use this as emphasis when people feel like it doesn't matter. It 100% matters if folks vote. So that vote, our vote on all those open seats will bring us into the 110th legislature, which starts next January. There will be at least 13 new senators, potentially more, for those who are running for re-election if they don't get re-elected. Also, very importantly, we're going to have a new speaker and new committee chairs. 7 of our committees for sure will have a new chair because these are all term limited. And then there are at least 3, if not more, that could, depending on how their elections go. This is a huge number for our committees. There's about 14, 15 sort of regular committees and a few extras, but that's like half of them. Other things to be thinking about for next session, there's the potential for rule changes. We'll have a new batch of senators. Some of our real stalwarts about the rules have left. And so that kind of opens the door to some changes. The governor has also been very vocal about wanting to change the number of votes needed for cloture. It is currently 33 of 49, and he wants to see that raised, because he feels that that is impeding his ability to get his agenda implemented. There are also some significant staff retirements and replacements in places like the clerk's office and bill drafting, which doesn't seem huge, but when you have that many new senators and losing that institutional knowledge is really going to change how efficient the process is. Probably take some time to work some of the kinks out as folks get used to it. There will also be new capital security measures. This was a bill passed this year. So we don't know exactly what those are going to look like, but of course, as we know, we'll share them out. But folks will probably go through metal detectors, things like that now, which we've never done before. Ah, it didn't, I hit the thing. Ah! Sorry, friends. Okay. Other issues that I just want to highlight because nothing is in a vacuum. Federal policy and national issues are having an impact on what we do. Going forward, there is still a continued fiscal impact of the Big Beautiful Bill, or H.R. 1. Those are primarily going to be in reduced revenue for the state of Nebraska because of income tax deductions and business credits. There are also service and program changes, including Medicaid work requirements. You may have heard about the implementation of those. That's really going to impact our budget and access, particularly for rural healthcare. And then private school scholarships will be federally implemented in January. And then I want to highlight redistricting and winner take all. And the redistricting might be worth a whole own lunch and learn. But if you've seen the Supreme Court's recent decision, basically all the rules are gone for redistricting. There used to be rules about not redistricting based on race, and they basically said, well, that doesn't count anymore. So it is not illegal to gerrymander for pretty much any reason now. I'm not hearing that we will have an effort to redraw our maps before the next census, but I would not put that out of the realm of possibility. As our budget's concerned, we already know we're going to have a budget problem next year. It'll be important to watch the rest of the year to see if what we anticipated to bring in, we're bringing in that much. It was a pretty rosy outlook, so we might even have more of a problem. Next spring, we also have the state level interim studies. So these are our current senators that are most of them staying on, that have identified a topic they want to really hone in on. And this allows them to do kind of a deep dive. I will share the list of those. A lot of times that's kind of like the precursor to legislation. But that's a good kind of list to look at to see what our senators are thinking for next year. And then finally, there's several citizen-led ballot initiatives out in the field. I'm sure you've been approached to sign some. Some of you might be the person approaching to have folks sign, but there are quite a few out there. Oh my goodness, I keep clicking that darn button. And then finally, local, state, and federal elections beyond just our state senators. Some of those elections are going to have really huge repercussions for our state government. And of course, our federal government, but beyond just policy. So I'm just going to pop these up real quick. I will share this as a PDF, of course, but here's some ways that you can be involved. We covered a lot. A lot happens in our legislature. There's a lot coming. So what can you do? These are things you can do. The biggest thing, though, is continue to do what you're doing now. Stay informed and talk to friends and family and neighbors about this. I would get the sense that, and you probably do too, many of our friends and family, they're living their lives. They just don't have the time to dig in and know the huge impact that some of these things have on their lives. So help our friends and neighbors. Don't feel like politics is something you can't talk about. We should talk about policy. It has an impact on our lives. Help them see that. And that is really, really the biggest thing you can do, which you're already doing by being here to begin with. So with that, I am so sorry. I've clearly picked up whatever my sons brought home from school. So I'm going to glance at the questions in the chat. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen. And I'll if Paula needs to jump in or anything, feel free. I'm going to take a look at these questions here.
And answer as many as you can, and then we'll close in about 5 minutes or so.
Sounds good. Is that legal to take grant money and redirect it? Doesn't it have to be used for the cause? Excellent question. It depends on who you ask. And I do anticipate that someone will bring a lawsuit about particularly the Environmental Trust Fund, because the language there is pretty darn clear about what it can be used for. So in some cases, it may not be technically illegal, but it doesn't feel right, which I think is an indicator. And in some cases, it may legitimately be illegal. But if no one asks them to not do it, they can do it, if that makes sense. So I do anticipate that there might be a lawsuit. Comment about people submitting testimony and their senators ignoring those concerns. I think that's a really fair point. I will say what I always say, don't stop contacting them. Maybe spend less time on it, but don't stop contacting them, because they don't give them the opportunity to say, no one cares about this issue or no one opposes this. Also, it is literally their job as your representative to hear what you have to say, even if it's not something that you find important or that they find important. I would also say this is one of the most powerful ways to get other folks interested, is have them reach out to their senator, because they may have a really great interaction and that's the best option. But if they have a really bad interaction, that makes them feel it in a way that is different. So encourage others to do that as well, but don't stop contacting. Question about emailing senators directly. it's a very depends type thing. Always you can email your own senator. There are some senators that if you are not their constituents, they do not care. So it just kind of depends. Let's see. Some information about the language that we're talking about with the every and only in there. Carol says, I've emailed a couple senators around interim studies and have not heard back suggestions. Yes, I would say feel free to email them again. Email them again because many of them just like shut off their brains for a whole month after session stopped, so they might be getting back into it. Second thing I would say is see if there's any co-sponsors on the study and include them. Third thing I would say is email them again and CC a friendly senator, and I'm happy to help kind of guide folks if they need to know who that is, so there's witnesses. And you can also, calling the office actually is a really great way because a lot of times the staff are the folks who are facilitating that. So good question. Have I heard anything about Medicaid as a nightmare? Yes, it is a nightmare, and I don't even know how they are demonstrating that right now, but the hospitals have expressed that this is really a problem. Don't have details on it though at this point. Okay, I answered so many so fast. I was very concise. That's not usually how I roll. So any other questions or concerns, feel free to drop in the chat, shoot me an email. I'm sure my email will be shared. And if this is interesting to you, please consider joining one of our action teams next year. When we get a little closer to session, you'll see emails and requests and info sessions. So always happy to chat more and get a cup of coffee and talk about how you can be involved. So Paula, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for a very informative session. Just a few closing comments. If you are inspired to make a difference in our democracy, consider joining our Lincoln and Lancaster County League. If you're not already a member, visit our website, lincolnleague.org. Now, our next Lunch and Learn will be June 4th. Stacy Decker and Molly Delaney will present Nebraska Public Media, Building What's Next. So we hope that many of you can join us again and tell your friends about it as well. If there's no more questions for Rachel, and I think we're getting close to the 1 o'clock hour, so I want to thank you for joining us today. And thanks again, Rachel, for an excellent presentation. And now we are adjourned.